This part 2 of the NIDDK Data Management and Sharing webinar series. Today's talk is titled Finding a Repository for Your Data. For any of you who are interested in the first session that we had in the webinar series on writing a DMS plan, please go ahead and check out the NIDDK DMS page for the link to that recording and materials. Next slide, Cameron. For now, we'll just give a quick introduction. We have a great group of speakers today that will be sharing a lot of important resources. We have Dr. Jaron Stratford from RTI, who will present resources from NIDDK to aid in finding repositories. We have Dr. Jeff Greta, who will share the Dknet group of resources. Dr. Rebecca Rodriguez will be giving an overview of the NIDDK Central Repository. And finally, Ishwar Chandramouli-Swaran will talk about the GRAY initiative. And so with that, we have up first Jaron Stratford giving his presentation, Finding a Repository for NIDDK Study Datasets. Off to you, Jaron.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Cameron, if you can go to the next slide. All right, so we'd like to welcome everyone to this second webinar in the NIDDK DMS webinar series. So in the last webinar, we had built a sound foundation about the DMS policy by discussing the who, the what, the where, and the when of data sharing. And in doing so, we reviewed all of the DMS elements that would be expected to be included in a DMS plan. Today, in today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on the where attributes. So if you can advance the slide. So specifically, in our last webinar, we talked about all 6 of the data elements. And if you want to review that, I would encourage you to go to the link at the bottom of the slide in order to review the recording. But today we're going to be focusing on the where. So how we're going to select where the data is deposited, how to identify a quality data repository, and how long the data will be stored. So this corresponds with the data preservation, access, and associated timelines element of the DMS plan. Next slide. So scientific data comes in many different formats, ranging from imaging, laboratory assays, clinical observations, animal studies, multiple different types of omics like genomics, proteomics, metabolomics. And all of this data has incredible value in terms of reuse. Historically, scientific data has generally been shared through publications or by requesting the access to the data from the authors of a publication. However, data repositories are emerging as a leader in this area, providing really great access to data and making our data incredibly fair. So fair standing for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Databases come in all sorts of flavors, and they have different features which allow them to make this data more fair, including the following. If you can go to the next slide. All right. So here are a number of characteristics of repositories that the NIH has established that should be really evaluated in determining the appropriate repository for the scientific data. Including the ability to store the data long-term, to house rich metadata that's associated with the scientific data, which we'll be discussing further in our webinar 3, which we'll encourage you to attend as the next webinar in the series. Additional characteristics include, the ability to protect research participant privacy and confidentiality, being able to access the data and having an appropriate amount of provenance. And so all of these different characteristics will factor into the selection of the repository. Next slide. And if you can advance this one more. So there are many, many different types of repositories that are available, and the number of biomedical data repositories is growing. They can be hosted by either the NIH or by public or by private institutions. Next slide, or next bullet. And the landscape of available repositories is continually evolving, and it responds to the needs of the investigators. Next bullet. And so researchers are really required to evaluate all of these different repositories and determine what type of repository is best for their data, whether that be a generalist repository, a data type specific repository, a disease specific repository, or any of these other domains. And because this is so vast, identifying the appropriate resources for sharing your data is a major concern for NIH investigators looking to comply with the DMS policy. Next slide. So the NIH has created a number of resources which are available for finding repositories that have a lot of these different characteristics that make them highly desirable and make the data very fair. There's also the ability to maximize the value of sharing the data and help it reach its maximum potential. So there are instances where the NIH or the centers or offices that have released the funding opportunity may have identified a particular repository for you to use. And if that's the case, it makes finding the repository very simple because you use the one that was prescribed in the funding announcement. If that is not the case, repositories need to be evaluated and the investigator needs to determine which one is the most appropriate. While doing this evaluation, it's very important for investigators to understand that having discipline or data type specific repositories is preferred. The reason being is that these repositories have specific infrastructure and tools for helping to make the data the most accessible, browsable, and findable in order to really encourage the reuse of this data. There are other additional repositories which are available that may not have some of these same tools and resources, but if your particular data type doesn't have a repository that is dedicated to that, then potentially generalist or institutional repositories would be appropriate. Now, the NIH has created a resource for querying across a number of approved repositories. If you go to the next bullet, this is available at the sharing.nih.gov, and by going here to this website, you can search for either institutes or data types or specific characteristics of the data to help you identify ones that are available. Next bullet. In addition, there are other tools for identifying repositories. There is the NIH Gray initiative, which we'll hear more about later today. There's also information from various publishers about repositories that may be acceptable, as well as the Registry of Research Data Repositories, which has a very nice search feature. So as you go looking for these data, or for repositories to house your data, these are some resources to help you get started. Next slide. In addition to the NIH recommendations for repositories, the NIDDK has created specific guidance for repository selection for NIDDK studies. And this guidance can be found on the NIDDK DMS website. So here, and highlighted with this red arrow, is the fourth data element, data preservation, access, and associated timelines, which describes some of these characteristics and preferences for repositories that we've talked about. You can go further in and review that website in order to gain additional information. Next bullet. Some of this information that is contained. Can you go to the next bullet? Okay, yeah, so some of the information that is contained on that website includes links to the central repository, Dknet, which we're going to hear more about later today, some of the links for NIH supported repositories and the Gray repositories. Next slide. Okay, so in addition, the NIDDK has created a repository selection considerations tool. This tool will help investigators identify the characteristics of the repositories and the preference of NIDDK for the data repositories based on each of your data types. So this tool is available at the NIDDK DMS website and starts off with a specific data type. So investigators in their DMS plans are encouraged to identify each of the different types of scientific data that will be shared. A repository selection decision tree is available, and there's a workflow that asks specific questions about that data type and leads you to understand the different types of repositories that are available and provides links to how to search for some of these repositories. In addition, there's examples in this decision tree that also describe how that workflow would be followed for specific data types for hypothetical studies. There's also additional considerations that factor in. Once you've identified a repository, your obligations don't end there. We need to go in and look at the policies for that repository and determine whether it's appropriate for your specific data type. There may be additional considerations about eligibility for accepting that study type, identification or de-identification, the file formats that are acceptable to the repository, as well as data linkage and metadata. There's also information in this tool which describes how to include this information into your DMS plan. Next slide. One of those considerations is whether that data needs to be controlled or whether unrestricted access to this data can be applied. And so by understanding the questions in the tool, you may be able to identify whether that is important and whether that is a requirement of the repository that you choose. Next slide. One of the things that repositories are really a characteristic of a repository that's very useful is a unique persistent identifier. This is an identifier that can be used in publications or in order to access the data. It provides kind of like a treasure map, where if the scientific data is the treasure, the metadata allows the key to open that treasure and use it, but the PID always points towards the treasure. And so by having this unique identifier, even if the location of the treasure moves, you're always able to find it. So being able to have a repository that produces these unique identifiers is a highly desirable characteristic. Next slide. So in summary, repositories are becoming the main resource for sharing data and making sure that our data is fair. Next bullet. But choosing an appropriate repository is really a multifaceted decision. There's many things that factor into it and considerations that need to be made. Next bullet. And the NIDDK has developed a number of guidance and resources and tools that are available to help investigators to make this multifaceted decision. And those can be available at the DMS website. Next page. And yes, and so by going to this website, you can have access to all these different resources. Next slide. Please reach out to your program officers if you have any questions, and those can really help inform us as we continue to make new tools and resources that help investigators as they go through this journey. Next slide. There are a number of additional resources that we've listed here. So when you get these slides after the webinar, we encourage you to go and review these resources as you go on your journey for identifying these data repositories. Next slide. And be sure to put any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll answer those following the presentations today. And thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Jaron. So up next, we have Jeff Greta presenting on Dknet resources. Dr. Greta?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to be giving an overview of Dknet and some of the resources that we do provide. Next slide. So for those who are unfamiliar with Dknet, Dknet is funded by NIDDK to provide a single point of access to information, around materials, tools, available services. But one of the key aspects over the last couple of years has been developing resources around fair data and the new data sharing mandate. Next slide. So when one comes to the portal, there are going to be 5 areas that you'll discover. The one that maintains to the data portal and to the data management services, finding repositories are the fair data services. Next slide. And so, getting help with, the NIH data management sharing plan is one of the places, that you'll want to go to first. And there may also be some highlighted areas in terms of, webinars we'll be hosting or office hours on the website. Next slide. So the first area is going to be, our informational area, and this is going to provide information, regarding, research data management and other aspects of the data management sharing policy. And we'll also provide, links that we have gathered, for informational sites that may be of use to researchers. Next slide. As mentioned in, there we go. As mentioned in the prior talk, we also have a list of repositories. We generated this list, in collaboration with our DK program staff. And this is a list that provides information on available repositories broken down by various disciplines. And some of the aspects to this is that we do provide direct links to the repository information for submission of data, for access to data. We provide some information, on potential costs of the repository. And then we also provide links out to Fair Sharing, which is a resource that provides information on the standards that were used. And so, referring back to the prior talk, there's a lot of information one needs to know about submitting data to a repository related to the standards that are used, the metadata, that's expected, the file formats. And what Fair Sharing does is it pulls that together. Next slide. One of the tools that we're working on that we'll be releasing this summer is a repository wizard. So through work that we have done with collaborators, we have rated 80 repositories against, FAIR principles, as well as principles for being an open repository, trustworthy and citable. So one of the key issues, with making data available nowadays is also making sure the data is a citable resource. And so that data can be tracked in terms of its usage so that, one knows and can one get credit for the data that one has made available. And so this wizard will also use a decision tree through this criteria, to assist researchers in the selection of a data repository. Next slide. We also have a number of other resources related to selection of repositories, standards involved. And so one of them is our Dknet Summer of Data Student Program. So this is a yearly program we run, for, graduate, undergraduate, postdoctoral researchers, that aims to teach importance about rigor and reproducibility, data management, and also fair data. And so this summer program also has associated with its various lessons, and these lessons, are made available through Dknet, so that that information is also available, in terms of fair data and data management in the relationship to the repositories where you'll be depositing your data. Next slide. We also have a webinar series, and part of this webinar series is dedicated to providing information about informatics resources and repositories. And so, through the number of years we have been running this, we have a number of resources about repositories, how to use these repositories. And this is freely available via either SlideShare for access to slides or through our YouTube channel for the actual webinars themselves. Next slide. One of the things that we have kicked off this year are office hours. And so these office hours have been really geared towards interacting, with, researchers about, the data management sharing plan. And also a lot of the questions through these office hours is really has been focused on, how does one select the appropriate repository for the data. And so these office hours we hold, right now we've been holding them quarterly. And the first two webinars for the office hours are also available via YouTube. And what we've also been doing is collecting information from these office hours. One of the aspects we also provide on the website is that we also provide a data repository inquiry form. So if you have a question about proper data repository selection, you can always fill out this form, and we will be back in touch with you to sort of discuss what repositories might be appropriate for your research data. Next slide. Oops, okay. So as I mentioned, we have been collecting these frequently asked questions from the office hours. And so here, we do have some information, about questions that have come up, during our office hours about repositories that are available in certain cases. And I said these office hours, about 20 minutes of the hour, is the presentations, but we do leave, a large amount of time, 40 minutes for answering any questions. So, if you do want to jump on one of these office hours in the future, we'll be happy to, answer any of your questions there as well. Next slide. And then this is a resource summary. And so, as I mentioned, we have a lot of different resources, for helping you, find a repository that is appropriate for your research data. We'll also work with you individually if you submit a request form. And then, we have a number of other resources that relate to some of the other webinars, in terms of the data management and sharing plan. So, we're here, we're funded by NIDDK, and we're here to help you, with your data sharing in the future.
Great, thank you, Dr. Greta. That was a great talk. So up next, we have Rebecca Rodriguez, who will be speaking about the NIDDK Central Repository. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Michelle. And I will build up on the prior two conversations and presentations to give a specific example of a repository. And for us, it's specific to clinical research data. I will go over our program, key eligibility aspects for submitting and sharing resources, and about how we support NIDDK scientific community achieve the spirit of the DMS policy. Next slide. As you may be aware, NIDDK plays a central and prominent role within NIDDK's data sharing landscape. And we do this by promoting sharing of resources and the fairness of those resources that can increase their scientific value. As you can see depicted here, we make those connections to ensure we can maximize their potential. Next slide. So we strive to be NIDDK's model of top quality resource sharing for supporting eligible investigators throughout their project's life cycle. That is the entire data sharing life cycle. And we do this by promoting the ethical and equitable archival and redistribution of specimens and data, enabling novice and seasoned investigators test new hypotheses without having to collect new data or biospecimens. We also think that this leads to impactful health outcomes a lot sooner. And one of our efforts is to continuously work to improve the discoverability of all resources under our guardianship and to minimize the barriers that could hinder access or utilization of those resources. Next slide. So what is the structure of our program? The repository program itself sits under the Office of the Director within the Office of Clinical Research Support, which by itself provides NIDDK community with resources and different functional areas to better support NIDDK's mission. For the repository program itself, the administration falls to NIDDK staff, and the operations side falls to contract or federal contract federal contracts. Let me stop there. Also, our repository component, specifically the biorepository, is CAP, CLIA, and ISO accredited or certified. And we are also currently seeking Core Trust Seal certification that is under review by their board. Next slide. By the numbers, we serve more than 20 countries worldwide, supporting active and concluded interventional or observational clinical studies that are funded by NIDDK. And we provide our end users with high quality, quantitative and qualitative clinical phenotype data and a wide range of biospecimens, all maintained under uniform and standardized conditions. This, we believe, it facilitates that secondary use that is so important to make really increase the impact of those resources. Right now, we have over 5,000 registered users that have access to our resources, and we have approved over 3,000 research projects. This translates roughly to 95% approval of all requests that we receive from the external community. Also, since we began tracking the public releases, we have received about 230, and this includes any releases such as abstracts, manuscripts, and presentations. Next slide. So how do we align with the fair and trust principles? So our policies and procedures are consistent with the desirable characteristics of data repositories. And in recent years, we have implemented several system enhancements and data measures, data quality measures that improve or help us adhere to the fair sharing and trust principles. Some of the things that we have implemented has been the data package versioning controls. We have also implemented the DOI through NIH DataCite, and have mapped the metadata for the studies that we host through schema.org that facilitates or helps us index those resources through Google Dataset Search and other registries such as fairsharing.org or R3 Data that helps us with discoverability of those resources. Next slide. We have also looked to improve our business logic and consolidated our documentation. And this is in a proactive effort to emphasize our standards, along with the enhancement that I mentioned before in the prior slides. This enabled the central repository and its practices to be trustworthy to the community. This demonstrates as well our commitment to fulfilling this, and not only fulfilling, but sustaining the spirit of the DMS policy. Next slide. So I think most of you are here for this. So how do I select a repository and what I need to be looking for? When it comes to selecting a repository, it is important for investigators to understand what does the repository offer and how the resources that you submit will be managed and shared. You will also need to understand or know any possible restrictions on eligibility or submission requirements. Here I list some of the items that the central repository offers, but one of the things I want to highlight is that those that are eligible to submit and are approved to submit do receive assistance with planning of that data archive in the sharing plan. And not only that, we also provide them assistance with good practices throughout the entire life of the project. And we do this following NIDDK and the repository policies and procedures. Next slide. So I have mentioned a couple of times NIDDK's central repository policies and procedures, but I know many of you are interested in what are those. So specifically, for us, we have is in our policy that prior to enrollment of the first participant, investigators must develop and NIDDK repository must approve a written plan that describes the timeline for submission and the timeline for public sharing. It also requires that data and biospecimens, if those are applicable to your project, be deposited in accordance with those approved timelines. One of the things I want to remind everyone is that our timelines right now are being revised to align with the DMS policy and with NIDDK's guidance. But one of the things I want to make sure that is translated across and emphasize is that our policies and procedures are meant to encourage the timely analysis of your work and increase the likelihood that they will be reused, for example, in secondary research, which will maximize the contributions of all those involved. And we also look to strike a balance between the interest of the data generators and the data users. Next slide. And all that is good, but who is eligible to submit at the NIDDK sample repository? So again, and we are revising our policies, but simply put, and our priority is and has been extramurally NIDDK funded clinical studies that receive significant programmatic support. But also eligible are other NIDDK supported clinical studies, such as those that are ancillary to those original studies that are submitted to the repository, or any secondary research that directly results from the use of our resources. So also want to mention that it doesn't have to be always NIDDK funded, but a select few non-NIDDK funded studies that we believe are within NIDDK's research mission and are deemed to be of significant impact or benefit to the scientific community may also be eligible to submit. However, I want to note that eligibility to submit does not guarantee acceptance. Next slide. So what will be the acceptance be hinged upon? All eligible or interested researchers that would like to submit to the repository must comply with our submission requirements, including the submission of and approval of the archival and sharing plan that I mentioned before, as well as the submission and clearance of your informed consent language. And that informed consent language needs to clearly define the permitted uses and how those resources will be shared and have future sharing requirements. So all approved submitters will be expected also to submit data in limited data set format, and those resources will be made available in controlled access. One other thing that I want to mention is that it is important for you to submit all supporting documentation, and that includes any code books, data dictionaries, and any supplemental information such as digital images if you collected those. And we have more descriptions in our submission requirements, and I have provided the link here. And you can do that later if you have more questions. Next slide. So what does the flow looks like? We have established, for when it comes to submission of those resources, a streamlined workflow and business logic for making sure that they come in and that they are given to the public in a streamlined workflow. So as mentioned before, you are required to submit that archival and sharing plan. That plan needs to be approved. You also have to submit that consent language, and that consent language needs to be cleared. And then once that is completed, we give you an approval letter that you are approved to submit. If necessary, we will also sign an MTA. And then once the data are submitted, they'll go through our regular process of curation and making sure that data is of high quality before they are made publicly available under control access. Our submission requirements are also listed here. So next slide. So of course, the full value and potential of the resources you generate and the spirit of the DMS policy can only be fulfilled if the resources that you generated are used in secondary research. That stresses the importance of the sharing portion, and not only sharing, but also of sharing quality resources. So with that, we make sure that our data sharing workflow focuses on providing easy and also enabling access that allows for that continuous data augmentation. So that means that materials that are generated from the resources come back and augment that data, and for us to connect those resources and continue that flow of our data augmentation. If you're interested in learning more about our processes, any of our provenance requirements, please make sure that you visit our website. We are including the link here. Next slide. So what about if I'm not eligible to submit, or what can I do? So the NIDDK and the NIDDK Central Repository recognize that this is a need of the scientific community. So the repository in response is implementing processes and cost listing or indexing NIDDK funded studies, supporting sort of a semi-federated sharing of those resources that are either deposited elsewhere or that we are not able to accept. So we also have partnered with other repositories, such as those from the GREAT initiative that Ishwar is going to cover in a second, and as well as other project-specific or institutional specific repositories to help us eliminate any unnecessary redundancies, as well as to bridge the gap of where the resources need to be deposited and shared. So with that, we also help investigators comply with the policy, but it is important that investigators recognize the value and in using metadata standards and the common data elements so that we can make the connections and continue to augment that data to really maximize the impact of those resources. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to end, and I'm going to give you here some links to important resources and our contact staff. We also want to make a plug in for our 20th anniversary workshop that is going to come in the future. And this is about promoting secondary research to accelerate breakthroughs. And I'm providing the link. And with that, I'll send it back over to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. That was an information-packed talk. I'm very excited to hear. And next we'll pass to Ishwar Chandramuliswaran, who will be talking about the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative. Mr. Chandramuliswaran.
Thank you, Michelle, very much, and thanks for the opportunity to share about the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative, also referred to as GREY by most people. So, but before we go into this, what are generalist repositories? They basically accept data regardless of data type, format, content, or disciplinary focus. So in a sense, they can basically kind of keep the barrier to entry fairly low for sharing data. And most importantly, everyone is quite eligible to kind of share data through these generalist repositories. Go to the next slide. So this slide shows you the strategic plan for data science that applies to NIH, and these are the 5 pillars that summarize the goals and the objectives, one of them being modernizing the data system. And so everyone's kind of striving to achieve this. We'll move to the next slide. Why do we want to modernize the data ecosystem over here? So a couple of compelling reasons over here. The first one is, of course, to eliminate or reduce silos in data, and because when we look at our system as a whole, we don't want data to be in complete silos. We want to optimize the cost for managing all of this data as it's been growing in leaps and bounds, and the costs are becoming prohibitive. So that's clearly a motivation to address that. We also want to disentangle resources from research projects, because we have invaluable research projects that are generating data, and these can be reused by others, of course, but they kind of get entangled into the research project itself. So kind of disentangling it is a motivation over here. And why do we want to do that? To allow for better sharing, better discovery, and reuse for hypothesis-driven research down the line. And of course, ultimately, we want to support the 2023 NIH data management and sharing policy, hence the need to modernize our ecosystem that's been kind of evolving, developing. The next slide shows you a little bit of a timeline as to how we kind of really came about supporting generalist repositories. We recognized that there were gaps in finding appropriate homes for data, and we were trying to figure out what are the best solutions over here. So back when the first NIH strategic plan was developed and we recognized there was a need to modernize this, we realized that we could bring in generalist repositories as part of the ecosystem to serve specific needs. So following the strategic plan, we launched a pilot project, which was incredibly successful, that demonstrated the gaps in the landscape that generalist repositories could fill for NIH-funded researchers. And it also validated that there's not only use of the generalist repositories, as was demonstrated in the pilot project, but it also, in fact, kind of changed the culture for data sharing when sharing is actually kind of made easier. Following which we kind of conducted a workshop that resulted in a fundamental concept called co-opetition to create ecosystems where folks could actually collaborate on common capabilities while still providing unique value proposition to the community. And this is exactly what we capitalized to launch the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative in 2022. And if you just kind of go to the next slide over here, we hope that this would help kind of fill some of the gaps and needs when the policy kicked in earlier this year, data management sharing policy kicked in. So if we move to the next slide, this kind of summarizes the vision and the mission of the initiative itself, where the goal was to develop collaborative approaches for data management and sharing, but by the generalist repositories to better enable search and discovery of NIH-funded data. So the goal was not to kind of provide the source. The repositories already existed. They had their own independent funding opportunities to kind of keep them sustainable. But the goal was to really have them work together to develop collaborative approaches that would enable better search and discovery of NIH-funded data that were kind of lost in the milieu out there. Very specifically, the mission that they're focusing on is really developing a common set of cohesive and consistent capabilities, services, and metrics, as well as social infrastructure between and across them. And also, of course, a secondary mission is to raise general awareness and facilitate researchers to adopt FAIR principles to be able to better share and reuse data. The next slide shows you the actual players, being 7 of them: Dataverse, Dryad, Figshare, Mendeley Data, Open Science Framework, Vivly, and Zenodo. They're kind of a very diverse mix of commercial, academic, as well as nonprofit organizations that have a common mission over here to enable sharing and reuse of data over here. The next slide shows you some of the objectives over here of what they're doing together is to implement consistent capabilities that was talked about earlier by some of the other speakers to address the desirable characteristics of repositories. And so what they've done is done a self-evaluation of their own repositories and kind of filled some of the gaps and to make sure that they address these desirable characteristics. To create better access and discovery of NIH-funded data, how do we do that? How do we change and capture some additional metadata or make sure that the search capabilities are enabled to search by certain fields to be able to discover NIH-funded data better? And of course, conducting outreach and training people on FAIR practices by engaging the research community were some of the key goals over here, with the hope that in the next slide, that this would make data sharing in general easier for everybody. Of course, improve the discoverability of data that's already out there and exists for others to be able to reuse it. And very importantly, address the reproducibility of research when these things are kind of captured in a FAIR process and enabling secondary reuse. So the next slide captures some of the objectives of GRAY. Again, kind of summarizing, I won't go into all the details over here. Again, aligning with the desirable characteristics of repositories to make sure that they're addressing that as part of a best practice. Developing consistent metadata models between and across them so that it becomes easier for researchers to know what elements need to be captured and collected and shared. And making sure that these can feed into an enhanced browse and search capability of NIH-funded data sets in these repositories. The repositories will also kind of implement some level of QA/QC so that to improve the quality of data that's collected and shared by the researchers. Enable connectivity of digital objects between and across them to prevent duplication of some of these research data sets. Implement open metrics and develop educational materials around the various use cases that could be repository-centric or cross-repository use cases, and share these through various outreach activities, webinars, and workshops, some of which you may have already attended through the course of the first year of this project. And in this process, they hope to fulfill the The next slide simply shows that while they're doing all of these activities, any software and work products that they develop, they actually share these in an open source with an appropriate license. So those in itself could be reused as well. The next slide shows you a couple of use cases that they're focusing on and support today, and they're continuing to build on those. So looking at this from across different stakeholders, we have a researcher perspective where they may want to find research data of interest so that they can validate the findings, reuse the data, or build on that work within their own discipline. As an NIH-funded researcher, you may want to kind of use a specific repository and share data so that they can comply with the data management and sharing plan and conditions for their own particular grant, as was kind of outlined by, again, some of these speakers today earlier. The next slide shows you a couple of other stakeholders. As a funder, I may be interested as coming from one particular institute to find data sets funded or to report on compliance within the policy itself to track the impact of research findings and the usage of these data sets. We have many efforts actually going on in kind of tracking the usage and the metrics associated with that, but that's another talk in and of itself. As an institution that has a bunch of grants from various funders, one may want to report on all data sets from their institution to ensure that they are being compliant with the data management and sharing policy. So these are all kind of some sampling of use cases, and these are all being collected and shared as well. And I'll show you in the next slide, shows you kind of takes you to the website where you can find the calendar of events that are available and hosted by the various repositories. And once the events are completed, the recordings are available, and they maintain a variety of work products across the repositories, of course, but also they have a community around the Zenodo repository where many of these assets are collected. They do encourage, and we would like you as a program also to join the community, reach out to the repositories as part of the Google Groups through Contact Gray at googlegroups.com. And you can also follow them through the hashtag Gray. And of course, each repository has their own Twitter handle as well. So the next slide basically kind of just summarizes that, through the initiative, we hope to implement several aspects that the strategic plan touches on, whether it's providing additional storage and preservation of options for data sets that may or may not have a home or support specific kinds of use cases. And in that process, improve the discovery and cataloging of NIH-funded data. And of course, most importantly, engaging with the community and in overall enhancing the stewardship of data as part of this journey to embrace new models for data stewardship. The next slide and the last slide shows you, takes you to our website, my office's website, datascience.nih.gov. And the QR code will kind of take you to the website where you can sign up to our newsletter, so you can learn not only about some of the developments in and around Gray, but also some of the other activities in general around data management and sharing, including our data management reuse seminar series that's available. Thank you, and pass it back to Michelle.
Thank you, Ishwar. That was a great talk. So I'll just take a moment to thank our speakers today. We are going to transition now to the question and answer session. So if the speakers can get ready to turn back on their video. Please, our audience, please continue to put questions in the Q&A box. And additionally, we will be dropping a link in the chat for a short feedback survey to help us better gauge the content of this webinar and to solicit feedback for future resources that can help you. Please take a moment to share your thoughts in that matter. And with that, let me open to the question and answer session. We got several interesting questions throughout the talks. Let's get started with more of a general question for our speakers here. What are some things that researchers can look for in a repository to ensure that their data are findable and that they can get credit for sharing? Perhaps, Jaren, you could start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. That's a great question. So there are a number of different characteristics that you can look for. If for getting credit for your submission, having that DOI is a great way because they can look to see how many times the data was accessed, how many times it was requested. You can get metrics on that that can show you how much your data was used. In terms of finding a repository that's very findable, there are opportunities for providing your metadata. So the metadata that you provide is indexed and is searchable. And so being able to find a repository that has search functions and requests certain metadata fields is a good indicator that other people who are searching for those same types of things would be able to find your data.
Great. Dr. Greta or Dr. Rodriguez, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the key things, again, for getting credit is it does go back to the DOI. So those are the same identifiers that research papers get, and so there is the data citation principle, that journals and repositories worked on, so that data sets, could have the same type of citation standards, that journal articles get. And so, being able to cite that DOI just like a regular publication, allows that data set to also be tracked, the same way that research paper citations get tracked.
I'm going to also add that the use of the org IDs is important as well. For example, if you are somebody like me that has such a common name and last name, everybody will. So in order to connect the resources and for me to receive credit for the work that I have produced, having that org ID helps me maintain that as well. And of course, the DOI is important, but sometimes that org ID, and if the repositories can offer that, it will help everyone maximize the impact of those resources.
Yeah, and you can actually also add data sets to your ORCID record as well.
The only other thing that I would build on in all of these is, yes, persistent identifiers obviously are kind of the most important thing, whether it's related to the data yourself as the researcher or any of the other digital assets. And this, in fact, forms an important part of the public access plan that's been put out by the White House's Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. So kind of learning more about persistent identifiers and how to incorporate that in your entire research lifecycle would be a fantastic endeavor.
Yeah, and that even translates to the reagents and organisms and other things used in your research through research resource identifiers.
Absolutely. Let me just take one moment to address a specific question to Ishwar about GRAY. We received a question: does GRAY have any provisions in place to assist PIs who might prefer using GRAY instead of finding in a more specific repository? And how would those provisions direct the investigators to those possibly more appropriate repositories?
So I think that's a good question. And so I don't know, the preference is driven by the science, but each of the GRAY repositories have services and capabilities. There's many common capabilities and some unique capabilities. So I would definitely encourage the investigators to reach out to each of the GRAY repositories, to the help desk. And these are services that they offer directly. What they're working on as part of the GRAY initiative is really kind of how to strive to develop some of these common capabilities working with each other, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel over there. But they do have their help desk, their services, and then they have reach out. And I think so I would definitely ask them to reach out to them and leverage their existing services.
So Michelle, I want to add to that response. So if your studies or the data that you're generating is clinical data, and you're not eligible to submit to the NIDDK Central Repository for whatever reason, we have partnered with one of the GRAY repositories, for example, Vivli, who is accepting clinical research data and makes those resources available similar to the way that this repository does, in control access manner. So if you need information about what NIDDK is doing to support investigators, either through the central repository or elsewhere, definitely look through Dknet what resources are available, or reach out to us at the central repository, because we may be able to help you and point you in the right direction.
Great, thank you for describing those resources to really support investigators in that decision-making process. We have another question here. In thinking about what should researchers do in situations when they have large data sets, but there is no clear designated repository, how would a researcher go through this decision-making process? One specific instance of this could be when a new assay or new data type becomes available and there's not yet any specific repository for that data type, but still keeping in mind that the total size of the files can be quite large.
Well, I can start that up. Oh, Jaren, you wanted to start that one?
No, go ahead. I'll add on.
Okay, good. So I think that one of the most important things that the investigators can do is first contact their program official. The program official should be able to advise what are some potential repositories that are adequate for the data that you generate. But if that is not possible, definitely there are other sources. For example, Dknet has that feature that allows you to find repositories that may be appropriate for the resources you're generating. And definitely there's other options, and not to go too much about the central repository, but we also, if all else fails, reach out to us, because even if you are not eligible to submit, we can point you in the right direction. But your first point of contact should be your program official.
I can add something to that. And so in terms of, we have certain large programs that are generating unique data types that are leveraging cloud capabilities. We have the STRIDES program, of course, but even outside of that, if the investigators already have their own cloud partners, they could share the data in cloud buckets and then also kind of cross-link them using either Generalist repositories or some other resources that are out there to point to the very large data set that may or may not be housed within, the pointer. So I think leveraging the cloud resources and buckets is one thing, so that you can have, for example, a use case where you're generating 3 different data types. There could some that could be sitting right in PubMed Central, something that's directly associated with the publication. Something else could be in Dknet and the central repository that's very clinical specific. And then there could be something that is processed or packaged in very large data sets in cloud that are being simply pointers to that. And so all of this could be kind of packaged into a notebook or a binder that could be sitting in another repository. This way you're linking multiple data sets that are across repositories, but tying that directly to a publication through your PIDs. So just kind of calling that as a use case.
Right, and thinking about the cloud environment as a way to avoid all the hangups associated with downloading and uploading data throughout that process as well. That's an interesting point. Let me just ask if anyone else had answers for that, Jaren.
Oh, I was going to say a lot of what Ishwar recommended is that there may be repositories for specific data types that could be linked. And so it might be possible to break an extremely large aggregated data set up into smaller components, but making sure that, that the linkage is maintained across the repositories. But no, I think that was well said, Ishwar.
Great. And so we just have 1 minute left. So let me put up a slide with just a couple reminders as you leave us. Thank you all for joining us today for this second webinar in the series, Finding a Repository for Your Data. We will send out a follow-up email soon that will give links to some of these highlighted resources and materials once they're available. We want you to know that we have 2 more upcoming webinars, one in June and one in July. Webinar 3 on June 27th. The registration is now open and the link just got dropped in the chat. So we really encourage you to check out those 2 remaining webinars in the series. As you leave, please take a minute to share your thoughts using the feedback survey link. A link will also be provided in the follow-up email. With that, I'd like to thank our speakers again and thank all of you, the audience, for attending. And we hope to see you at our next event.